It's California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. Today we are joined by C. Bradford. He's a member of the California State Assembly. And sir, you're also heading up a select committee on boys and men of color. I'd like to speak specifically about boys and girls who happen to be African American, part of a subset of that group. If you look at UC admissions, the African American community is being admitted to the UCs at a rate of about 4%. That level has been flat for, 4 or 5 years. We have a population in California of African Americans of about 11%. You know, I don't want to be a bean counter here, but it's hard to not see that split from 4% to 11%. What's happening?
Well, we're discussing it for sure. We've been part of the Legislative Black Caucus's agenda of increasing African American enrollment, both men and female, and having constant discussions with not only the chancellor, the CSUs, but UCs as well, to let them know that this is critically important, even to the point of trying to expand those African American study courses in college, which we find more and more being cut.
What I've noticed and what I've read is that the numbers are so low that African Americans are not even putting the UCs on their list. No. I mean, it's getting to a point they're just looking elsewhere, qualified, as they may be. And so, one could argue we're getting to a point where the UCs are losing a big chunk of a potentially exciting population.
Of the two institutions of higher ed here in California, UC and CSU, yes, UCs are trailing far behind. CSU's not much better. Okay. And the community colleges were the major influx right now because of the affordability and a little greater access to classes to get to junior ed. But we're in discussion right now. How do we increase enrollment, and not just enrollment, graduation rate as well? What
I'm wondering though is, as I said, you head up boys and men of color. I would, the Latino community would fall under that purview. The Latino numbers at the UC system have been ticking up. At this stage, Latinos for the classes coming fall, first time in this UC's history where there will be more Latinos than Anglos. So where is the disconnect? Why is it the Latino numbers are increasing in terms of admits, but African American numbers flat?
I don't want to pit one against the other, but I think there has been a more targeted, enrollment effort to outreach there, and that's what we want, additional more dollars in the budget for outreach.
But the challenge, this as well as anyone, we have Proposition 209 on the books. Prop 209 says there could be no preferences made based upon race, color, gender, creed, whatever it may be. So I'm not even sure what outreach would look like and stay within the purview of 209.
Targeting those schools, those high school institutions that cater to that population base.
And that's okay?
It's very much so, because if you're not reaching them, how do they have an opportunity?
But in terms of Prop 209, that's not...
No, we're not seeing set up any quotas and saying you have to admit this many numbers, but you at least have to touch that population and say, seats are available, you are welcome here, because we have a committee on campus climate, and we're finding a lot of African Americans are not enrolling based on what we're hearing at San Diego, UC San Diego, what we've heard at Cal State San Jose.
There have been some unfortunate incidents where, the worst tropes that we have in our society have been played up. The Compton cookout, I don't even know where to go with that. At San Jose State, there was an issue. It does seem like a lot of minority groups are being targeted in different ways on campus. So there had been a discussion earlier this year about looking at Prop 209 and whether Prop 209 should be revisited. The conversations just fell apart in an epic way and really pitted Democrat against Democrat. Many members of the Asian American caucus were feeling attacked by members of the African American caucus, Latino American caucus, whatever it may be. How are relations now? I mean, that was a tough time.
It's good. It's better. Again, once calmer heads prevailed, they realized it was not about excluding one group for the other. It was about expanding enrollment for all of these folks. We've seen where the numbers have gone down drastically, like you say, for the African Americans. And even though there's an uptick for Latinos, that number is still dismal when you look at the overall population of college enrollment. So,
Asian American numbers. Soaring,
without a doubt,
continue to soar way above the proportion in the population. I guess that's the intent behind Prop 209, colorblind. Where do we go with that, though? I mean, it really does cause it's even tough to talk about. You know, where do you go?
But again, I think it's systemic problem sometimes, again, based on the early foundation of education. And if you're in these underperforming schools, then college, direction going toward college is not what's discussed. So you're not preparing yourself. And if the schools aren't encouraging it, chances are the parents are not encouraging it if they're not college educated. So I think it's a, cause and effect type of situation.
Let's talk about underperforming schools. It's hard to deny that during the recession, K-12 was just plummeted by draconian cuts. It's also hard to deny that since Prop 30 passed, since the economy has turned around, Governor Brown has been doing everything he can to restore the cuts to K-12. Some would say to the exclusion of, UC, CSU. Do you feel as if we have turned a corner on K-12 and that we are going to see better days with public schools?
We can only hope. I mean, have we put more money in this budget? Without a doubt. It's the best budget I've been a part of since being in the legislature.
And you entered at a tough time.
Exactly. Right. So it's no argument there's money there, but as it relates to the overall cuts, we still have a long way to go. The governor's hoping that LCFF, local control funding formula, will help, but we've already heard rumblings there that, again, we want to make sure these schools of color, these underperforming schools, get these resources directly again to the boys in these schools where we're seeing again, despite being there and despite having money, they're not spending it on the folks who need it.
It's interesting, we talk about LCFF, local control funding formula, gives more money to schools that serve economically disadvantaged, foster kids, English language learners. Well, that at some level seems like a potential formula for outreach. Many folks of color may fall into those categories. So is that a way to look at the debate and not run afoul of Prop 209? Because look, a kid who's Anglo or a kid who's black, if they come from an underprivileged neighborhood, they're going to face very similar challenges, no?
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
I think this is a way of capturing everyone.
I mean, can we do affirmative action by zip code as opposed to by color of skin?
Yeah. I mean, that's what we're doing with these underperforming schools, but what we find out, most of them are occupied by people of color, unfortunately.
Right. So, but I mean, look, maybe I'm going in a place that I shouldn't go, but it does seem as if that is one way to really look at this, because in the final analysis, it does feel as if a lot of the problems behind low admission rates for folks of color is really about socioeconomic status. I'm not a sociologist.
Exactly.
What do I know? But I do wonder if we can really look at zip codes as a way to try to improve outreach and even improve admits.
I think that's a valid point. I think we need to look at all the information that's before us to make sure we shape this program and make sure it works. That's what we're in constant debate with the governor's staff, to make sure that LCF really works, that it goes to the local schools where they're not producing high graduation rates, but at the same time, not just get the money, but make sure the money is spent on the students, because you can still get the money and move it around and do all these other special things. We want to be spent on those students and make sure they succeed.
We also know recently there was a decision known as the Vergara case. And in the Vergara case, the court held that teacher tenure rules were unconstitutional. Without getting too much into the weeds on the case, the propriety or impropriety of it, the case is very significant. And so I'm wondering, does Vergara restart the conversation on education reform?
Without a doubt. It's been a discussion that's already taken place immediately in the Capitol after the decision. It's one where we've always said it shouldn't be harder to fire a teacher than a lawyer or a doctor. And
one could argue.
And it has been like that. So we're looking at this in a holistic review. We have to bring the teachers to the table, because again, they have to be a part of that.
Will they come to the table?
We see movement, but we see a great opportunity to really tackle this issue, because it's one of great concern, and it puts the children at risk when you have teachers.
His name is Steve Bradford. He is a member of the California State Assembly. My name is Brad Pomerance, and this is California Edition. It's California Edition. My name is Brad Pomerance. We are joined by Dan Schnur. He was a candidate for Secretary of State in the state of California. He has a long history in politics. He is the director of the Unruh Institute at USC. He was a spokesperson for the McCain campaign in 2000. He worked for Pete Wilson. He was the chair of the Fair Political Practice Commission. I can go on and on and on, but thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Brad. I appreciate it.
I have admired you from afar, and I'm glad to have you on the program. I want to speak with you about the Secretary of State's race. We recently had a primary. You were one of the candidates. A good amount of heat surrounding your candidacy, running as no party preference. In the end, you didn't make the runoff. The individual that came in third, not making the runoff, was Leland Yee. And here's the headline from the LA Times, and it says, "How did Yee get that many votes?" Leland Yee was indicted, and his name was still on the ballot. How did he come in third?
Well, this is a guess, and it's only a guess.
Please.
Most Californians know, they have some awareness that there's been a series of scandals in Sacramento. What I don't think most Californians could do is recite the names of the legislators involved in those scandals. So if you stopped someone on the street, they'd say, yeah, they're all corrupt, they're all crooks. But if you ask them who is Rod Wright, who is Ron Calderon, who is Leland Yee, they probably wouldn't know. And in a low information primary, in a primary election, in a non-presidential election year, with a pretty one-sided race at the top of the ballot, I suspect that between Senator Yee's ballot designation,
it still said state senator,
his party registration,
Democrat,
and his surname,
Yee,
combined to get him just under 10% of the vote.
And his surname being Yee, so there's some ethnic affinity for those voters that may be Asian American. We also can't ignore that Betty Yee was running for controller, same last name, and she was fairly visible. And so do you think that helped the non-candidacy of Leland Yee?
And Betty Yee, to her credit, received endorsements from several of the state's newspapers. But I think the underlying point, and I'm glad you brought it up, Brad, is a lack of information that a lot of voters had on the campaign. And to me also, that was the challenge that our campaign faced. I was the first plausible independent candidate to run for statewide office in California history.
And I want to ask you about that, because if there was ever an independent candidate that would rise through the morass that is the jungle primary, I would have thought it would be you.
Well, that's nice of you to say. And there are, it appears by the time we're all done, about 400,000 Californians who will agree with you. But we needed another 500,000 on top of that to agree. All that said, the same lack of information that allowed 9.5% of Californians to vote for Leland Yee for Secretary of State, not knowing that he was one of the legislators involved in the scandal, that same lack of information, we believe, was the biggest obstacle to my campaign. Because even if you're a voter that's not happy with your choices between Democrats and Republicans, seeing a D or an R next to a candidate's name gives you a cue and gives you some guidance. And I think what we realized, obviously too late, is the kind of conversation that we would have needed to have with voters, not just to convince them to vote for candidate B rather than candidate A, but to reject long-held partisan voting habits, is a longer conversation and a more expensive conversation than we were able to have in just a few months.
And what's remarkable is I read recently that in California there are 18 million registered voters. That is larger than the population of 45 states. I wonder if you had been running in New Mexico or another, smaller type state, Arkansas, if you could have broken through. Under the same kind of jungle primary, running as no party preference.
Well, it's certainly easier and less expensive to communicate with voters in a smaller state. No question about that. But I think once again, we're telling people, even independent voters, said, we know you've been voting for D's and R's for your entire adult life. We want you to do something fundamentally different. I think just as much as not having the money for that conversation is not having the time. And in retrospect, I think the one thing that we could have done differently is, rather than beginning this campaign in January of 2014, beginning it in January of 2013, to really have a chance to talk to voters and say, here is a chance to tell the two parties that you're not satisfied with how they're doing business.
And if I may ask, I want to talk to you about D's and R's, because you have been known as one of the most successful R's in political operations of our generation. I mean, I know Mr. McCain didn't win in 2000, but that campaign was considered quite a scrappy one. You worked with Mr. Wilson, and so you could have easily run as an R. I don't know if you'd win in November as an R, given a blue state, but if the Republicans can't keep Dan Schnur, what's happening with Ds and Rs?
Well, two things. Number one, I switched my party registration not for this race, but actually for a few years ago because I wanted to pursue campaign fundraising reform.
Right.
And as you know, one of the centerpieces of my campaign was the effort to ban fundraising while the legislature was in session. And I just didn't feel like you could accomplish that kind of reform from inside one party or the other.
Sure.
But you ask an important, broader question, Brad. I tell people, I said, look, this is who I am and this is what I believe. I'm for lower taxes and marriage equality. I'm tough on crime, and I'm pro-choice. I believe that citizenship is a necessary part of immigration reform, and that student test scores are an equally necessary part of teacher evaluations. When push comes to shove, neither party will have me.
Yeah, no. Well, one could argue both would want you, but no, I hear you. You are.
And the decline, the no party preference voting bloc is the fastest growing cohort in California politics. More than 21% of Californians are now independent no party preference voters. What we needed to do, and we're not able to do, is convince those people who've registered independent to vote for an independent candidate also. We simply weren't able to provide them with enough information about me to get them to break out of the habits that had allowed them to vote Republican or Democrat for years prior.
You mentioned fundraising reform, and there is no doubt that our fundraising system is daunting, to say the least. We can say a lot of things about Leland Yee. It appears he did cross the line, but in the final analysis, after looking at that situation, it appears that he crossed the line because he thought he needed to raise money to run for office. He wasn't embezzling so he could live a lavish lifestyle. He was raising money. That really speaks to the pressures of fundraising, especially in an era of term limits where you can't stay in an office, become an expert, and move forward.
And that's really what had changed since my years in Sacramento. When I went back to Sacramento to chair the Fair Political Practices Commission in 2010, I'd been out of state government for 16, 17 years. Now, fundraising's always been a necessary part of politics. But what had changed over the years since I'd been gone, Brad, is that fundraising wasn't just a part of politics. It was dominating politics. It was overwhelming politics. It was poisoning politics.
It takes about $1 million to win a state legislative seat in California.
Which means that that the candidates for the state legislature spend every waking moment they can raising money. And if you go to Sacramento during session, you will see that every breakfast, every lunch, and every dinner is a fundraising opportunity. Basically what you see is a relay race in which the politicians of both parties sprint off the floor of the Assembly or Senate, across the street in downtown Sacramento to the nearest restaurant. They pick up a stack of special interest checks from individuals with business before the legislature. Then they sprint back across the street to vote on those bills before the ink on the checks was even dry. That's why I want to ban fundraising during session. That's why I'm encouraged that the state Senate has taken a version of my proposal and is currently acting on it.
But how does that help? Because the candidates still need to raise $1 million to win. That just compresses the time within which they need to raise the $1 million, which creates an even more pressureful situation, and you get Leland Yee Part 2.
Because I believe that, as long as the U.S. Supreme Court argues that when it comes to political expression, that money equals speech, I think the best we can do, and I think it is a significant step forward, is to weaken the link between political giving and government action. Because if you are a legislator, and I write you a check 6 months before a key vote, the visceral and emotional impact is just not going to be nearly as great as if I write you that same check the morning of the same vote.
But what about the challengers? The proposed law doesn't apply to challengers.
The proposal doesn't apply to challengers because it can't, because there is no conflict of interest for a challenger, and therefore the proposal would interfere constitutionally with the right to free speech. That said, incumbents get reelected 98% of the time. They start with all sorts of inherent advantages. I think this is one that they would be just fine without.
His name is Dan Schnur. He is the director of the Unruh Institute of Politics at the University of Southern California. My name is Brad Pomerance. This is California Edition. It's California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. We are joined by Bruce Barrows. He's a council member in Cerritos, immediate past president of the Los Angeles Division of the League of California Cities. So I want to speak about the relationship between cities and Sacramento. I think it's fair to say over the last decade or so, it's gotten a bit rocky. Talk to us about why relations are fraying between Sacramento and cities.
I think the simplest way to phrase it is Sacramento has, in essence, said that instead of them raising taxes, they're going to force the cities to do it. So they force those responsibilities to us without the funding. And
we look at, for example, the elimination of redevelopment. That was a thorn in the side of so many cities who saw that as an effective tool. We saw realignment whereby prisoners are being sent down to county facilities for lower level crimes. That's caused a lot of angst amongst county officials.
It's caused, yes, county and cities. The part that people don't realize is that the county has to pick up and provide all the services now because of realignment. But the issue is the crime rates on breaking and entering is skyrocketing in all the cities. And the bad part is that people that do break into a home, if we arrest them on a Friday, they're back out in the streets by Tuesday.
Along the same lines, there's also a frustration and for some a surprise that Sacramento will pass laws that will apply to all governmental entities except the California legislature. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely not. And take, for instance, the most recent thing was Prop 42.
Explain.
Prop 42, it was just passed with a good vote. It's all about open government, which no one has a problem with. But what they did in there is they didn't tell people that the cities were still abiding by it, because they took that out when they put Prop 30 out to help balance the budget. So there's a little line item in there, and it removed that requirement. And the problem is the state was having to pay some cities back $48 million a year.
For open records.
For open records to produce all those. Our city didn't, we charged whoever bought their copies and stuff, but we didn't try and get money back from the state on it. So they fixed that under Prop 42 and took $48 million out of this multi-billion-dollar budget they have and shifted that to the cities. But what they didn't tell anybody is that Prop 42 has a back door to all the cities saying that now, whatever they want to pass, the cities have to produce at no cost for the state.
When you say they want to pass, meaning?
They can, inside any legislation they want, they can ask for any new information, regardless of whether it's good or easy to get a hold of. Whatever they can think and create, they can now demand of all the cities.
So why is it that Prop 42 seemed to just have an easy path to victory? I mean, we weren't hearing a lot of these kind of, the asterisks, I guess you could say. Was it just the power behind Sacramento?
Well, it depends on how you go ahead and put a title on a proposition. And that part about a open government, people want that. But what people don't realize is that the legislature in 2004, under Prop 59, when they first brought the constitutional amendment out to require open government at all levels, including state, down in a fine print, they exempted themselves from it. So they have a lot of backroom deals go on, and people wonder why we have a lot of problems with the legislation come out, because it's all written based on special interests or a partisan point of view, or us versus them.
So let's talk about what people are calling backroom deals. We know there's something called the Brown Act. And the Brown Act, if you work in local government, is this grand, it's the 800-pound gorilla in the room. And what the Brown Act essentially says is that a majority of an elected body cannot speak in a meeting that is not in the public. So if you're in a city council that has 5 members, if 3 of you get together and talk about an issue before the city council, you have violated the Brown Act. And so what that does is, the intent is that all negotiations are done in open session. Talk us through the ramifications of that.
Well, basically it's referred to as the Sunshine Act.
Right.
So that nothing happens in the back rooms or in the dark, or secret deals are made. It's also, I think it's very beneficial, quite frankly. it makes for a very clean operation from a resident's point of view. They can watch any meeting and know that what's going on is right there, is live, and nothing's been done and decided beforehand. And if you look at the problems in a few other cities, like Bell.
Yeah, we've heard of that.
When you have deals done in the back room, it's usually done at the request of a developer or some special interest or some special interest or family members of the elected officials. And there's a lot of examples of that, over the years, and where council members have gone to jail and stuff, and rightly so. From my point of view, if it's out in the open, I'd rather have it out in the open because no one's going to question.
But at the same time, I understand the desire for transparency. Believe me, I do. But it does seem a bit artificial. When you think about business, when you think about social situations, I mean, life is part of the art of negotiation. And if you can't have a negotiation with council members over certain issues unless you're on this dais where you're really not even sitting next to each other, you can't look at each other, how do you engage in reasonable negotiation?
I think that's probably where there's a loss to it, is you don't have that. As we shared earlier, under the Brown Act, I'm allowed to go ahead and any council member can talk with one other, just not a majority.
Right.
So when you mention 3, that's a no-no.
Right.
2's okay. So you have to choose that person you speak with wisely.
Right.
And the person that you agree with all the time, you don't want to talk to them.
Here's the rub, though, when you talk about the Brown Act. The Brown Act applies to all local governmental bodies. It does not apply to Sacramento. And that is really how and why you wrote what I would call is a pretty powerful op-ed that was published in the Los Angeles Register. And you talked about this whole notion, this whole discussion we've been talking about, laws passed by Sacramento that apply to everyone but Sacramento. And so you're looking to really start a movement. And you're a council member from Cerritos, but you're also the past president of the Los Angeles Division of the League of Cities, so you got folks listening to you. And as part of this movement, you'd like to see that any law that Sacramento passes must apply to Sacramento. So talk to us about your campaign, I guess you could say.
Well, it's obviously, I just wrote this, so it's
in its infancy.
And I took some time thinking about it, because I didn't want to go ahead and not have all the facts straight on it, first of all. Secondly, one of the things that bothers, I think, a lot of folks is when a bill's going through a long process, when they come out in January, by the time they get right down the deadline, you find out the bill has been gutted, all the information.
Gut and amend, it's called.
Yes, and it's all gone. And new stuff is in, they vote on it, maybe that same night or the next morning. And, which just happened less than a couple months ago.
It always happens.
Well, they passed a resolution, which is interesting, in the assembly. They had a discussion that night. The next morning they voted on it without any input from anybody. And the resolution, they didn't want to have a bill go through because then it's going to become more public. But every bill is going to be slanted to take up this philosophy that they just passed. And that philosophy that they passed, that resolution, is to say that no city can contract out for services. And this is a request made by one of the unions, ASM. I think that's, ASM. Mm-hmm. And from that, every city that uses contract services, all their expenses are going to go skyrocketing. Now, we've had a ton of money taken away from us for the last 10 years. And our city's over $60, $70 million, and they're still asking for another 177.
So what I'd like to do is, as you march forward with this campaign, will you come back and talk to us about it? Because I have a feeling that you're going to build steam behind this, because I know cities are so very frustrated with how these laws are being passed that some would say don't apply to Sacramento itself. His name is Bruce Barrows. He is a council member in Cerritos, immediate past president of the California League of Cities in Los Angeles. I'm Brad Pomerance. It's California Edition.